There was a lot of utopianism about the internet in its early days.
Because it was utopian, Matt.
You've got mail.
People can get drunk sometimes, especially when they're young, or do cocaine. What did President Obama say? Do a little blow and move on, and you're fine.
What do you think you win if they're all racist, right? That tells you half the country are irredeemable racists. Everyone at that dinner got a job offer from The Atlantic except for one person, if you remember. And that person was Ezra Klein. It's changed politics, right? It's made left-wing politics more radical. It's made right-wing politics more populist.
The New York Times was like the most important newspaper in 1995, and it's the most important newspaper.
Fact check, false. The internet has been very good to me. In 2001, fresh out of business school, I read an article in Time magazine about these newfangled blog things. And I thought, I don't know, maybe I could do that. So I had no experience in journalism other than writing my business school gossip column, the uncensored voice of the GSB. And I didn't plan on becoming a journalist, but it turned out I actually really liked writing about business and economics. And even more surprisingly, it turned out that there were actually people who were willing to read what I wrote. If I hadn't started that blog, I'd probably still be a consultant somewhere. Instead, I got one of the greatest jobs in the world where I get to ask smart people how the world works, and they tell me. But the internet hasn't been so great for everyone. It's upended our politics, for one thing. It's also disrupted a lot of industries, including, I am sad to say, mine. The world I grew up in had 3 television networks. It had 3 major news weeklies. It had a local newspaper in every city or town, and that world is gone. We've just come off a presidential election where the candidates were doing more interviews with podcasts than they were with outlets like the Washington Post. It has been a wild ride. My guest today, journalist Matt Yglesias, has been on it with me on this roller coaster, screaming as we went over the hills for the entire time. Matt runs one of the most popular newsletters on Substack called Slow Boring. It is a reference to an old philosophy quote. It is not a description of the excitingness of the newsletter, which is great, and everyone should subscribe to it after you have subscribed to the Washington Post. He's also a columnist at Bloomberg, and he co-founded the media company Vox. He's written and podcasted and tweeted all over the internet. So I wanted to bring him on the show today to talk through the media's recent past, its present, and its future, and how it continues to shape our politics and how we talk to each other. I wanted to explore how our careers have followed all of these shifts, but in opposing directions often, and how we've now mostly landed in a more pragmatic place and what that means going forward. Matt Yglesias, welcome to Reasonably Optimistic.
Glad to be here.
So Matt, you and I go way back.
We do.
We started out as political bloggers in the early 2000s during the George W. Bush administration, and I actually met my husband at a party at your house.
Yes.
I feel like our career paths have both traced an interesting time in politics and social media, and I want to talk through all of that. But let's start by going back to that blogging era. How and why did you become a blogger?
So I had been an intern in Chuck Schumer's office, and one of my responsibilities there was gathering like the Schumer clips, right? And this was mostly analog. Like I literally like cut things out of the newspaper. I faxed them to like the office in Rochester, Buffalo, et cetera. But they also wanted us to start monitoring the internet.
This crazy new invention.
Yeah. And so it was through that I found the earliest blogs, Josh Marshall, Andrew Sullivan, Mickey Kaus. And I really liked them. I liked all 3 of them. And then I decided in 2002, I was sitting around my dorm. My roommate was a computer science major. And I was like, I want to write one of these blogs, Francis. Like, what do I need to do? He gave me terrible advice. He didn't say like, you go to blogger.com and you could start a blog. He like taught me how to like write it on a website.
I remember hard coding the HTML back in the good old days, doing all my little tags. I wrote my posts.
Yes. And so then, I was doing it, and it was, the audience must have been tiny by contemporary standards, but it felt big. It's like there were people there, they were reading, they were paying attention.
I still remember when I got my first post that had 1,000 readers, and I was like, 1,000 people.
Right. And you'd get a link from somebody. I think like Matt Welch was the first like big quote unquote person who linked to something that I wrote. And so, I was doing that in college, and then I needed to get a job, obviously, at some point in time. And
tragic.
Yeah. And the American Prospect at that time, primarily a print magazine, had a small website. The website ran a blog. And Richard Just, who was like in charge of the website at that time, was interested in getting entry-level employees who were interested in like doing digital journalism. Because at that time, it was still very much like not the thing to be doing. So he reached out to me, encouraged me to apply. I got a job. And so ever since, this is like the only job I've ever had, which is sort of humiliating.
I did have jobs before I went to business school, but yeah, for the last 20 years, I just type words on the internet and sometimes in print, and people read them.
I guess I worked at Barnes & Noble.
Yeah, I mean, like, yes, I had high school jobs. I was a hotel maid. I put shirts on racks at Banana Republic. So let's have some wistful reminiscence here. We're both of a certain age. Me of a somewhat more certain age than you. What was great about blogging? What do you miss?
I mean, I've been thinking more and more about this and like, what do I miss? Something that I think was really neat about the early internet is that the bandwidth was enough to transmit text all around the world. Newspapers were very important social institutions, but the early internet was like 10xing print, really. And you could hear from people who had domain expertise, writing for themselves, whether that was academics, people from the business world, all kinds of different things, hear from different people. It seemed very sort of exciting. And then, as is sort of the case with everything, right? As it advanced, it like became more mainstream, which is good in a lot of ways. Like more people got access, more people were online, but it all just came to have the same like blah quality of any big mass media. It was good to be an early mover, right? I mean, the audience at that time, the audiences were small. It was relatively easy to break in because it was such a small universe, but then like writing at rapid pace on the internet became a more and more valued skill.
I had moved to Washington, D.C. in 2007. And Obama was just coming on the scene. I followed most of the primary from your house. And President Barack Obama emerged during this era. It's a long time ago, but how do you think the changing media ecosystem enabled his ascent? Or did it? Was this just actually a pretty standard old style campaign?
Well, it had aspects of both, as with anything, right? I mean, I do think it's important when you look back to see that things like behind the scenes, Nancy Pelosi and Ted Kennedy supporting him, elite sort of politics. He got both a lot of sort of progressive members of Congress, but also a lot of the more frontline red state members were pulling for him, and all that stuff kind of mattered a lot. But also, he benefited from a more sort of open and rapid discourse environment that allows a person to, to break through, right? When, it's easy to sort of forget because he was president for 8 years and has become such a pillar of the Democratic Party at this point. But it really was an underdog, very anti-establishment race at the time that he first launched. And, the view among people in the party was like, you might prefer him, but if you were working on that campaign or were openly seen supporting it, when he lost, as he probably would, like there would be hell to pay, that Hillary Clinton's vengeance would be the end of your career. And so, it meant that a lot of the people who were on that campaign were not, coming necessarily from the mainstream ranks of Democratic Party donors or operatives, things like that. And the way that the internet was bringing more people into the political process, right? It used to be that to donate to a political campaign was like an incredibly weird thing to do. And if you did it, you were probably like a professional lobbyist.
Or a very rich person who knows professional lobbyists.
Yes. Or like, you would be like Jeffrey Katzenberg, and you were bundling all the Hollywood money, and you were like FaceTime with Bill Clinton. And starting with John McCain, and then with Howard Dean, and then with Obama, it was like small dollar hobbyist giving over the internet became more and more of a thing. And that's really transformed politics in 90 different ways.
In a good way?
Mostly not, but But you don't want to be too nostalgic about the old system either.
Yeah, it's changed politics, right? It's made left-wing politics more radical. It's made right-wing politics more populist. But I think it also bothers me that it kind of scams a lot of people. And you write a lot about this, but do not give money to Beto O'Rourke, who is not going to win in Texas. I know it makes you very excited to imagine. It's like buying a lottery ticket, right? And it seems to me that's what the Beto O'Rourke candidacy is, right? He's not going to win in Texas, but I really love fantasizing about what if a Democrat was going to win in Texas. It scams people out of a lot of money. I'm now on all these fundraising lists, so I'm constantly barraged with emails purporting to come from some Democratic or Republican politician, and I just ignore them. But the people who don't ignore them have no idea that they are just being held up for money that is probably not going to be very effective at getting what they want.
Yeah, and I mean, it has changed. I was talking to somebody about the next Texas Senate race and the prospect that Jasmine Crockett might get into it. And I was being very skeptical of the merits of this idea. And it became clear to me that the person I was talking to was not like excited about Jasmine Crockett as a potential winner in that race, just as a business proposition. Like, he felt confident that she would raise a lot of money, which then meant that she would spend a lot of money, which then meant that, having a piece of the Jasmine Crockett ad buys would be very lucrative. Now, of course, there's a business aspect to politics and always has been, but the more the huge increase in the amount of money in the campaign ecosystem has meant that it has become a much more cynical business than it used to be. It used to be much more the kind of thing where it was like, if you really wanted to make money in advertising, you would just like work for soap companies, right? And you were like doing politics because you cared. And the more money there is in politics, not in the like traditional like, ooh, boo, money in politics, it's corrupt. It's like corruption from the other end, right?
So I actually want to talk about you and I. We got further apart after the Obama years. We both supported Obama in the primary, if I'm remembering correctly. And we both voted for him in the general election. But by the end of the Bush era, like libertarians and progressives were more aligned because the Iraq War and so forth. But then Obama happens, and the big political fights are about healthcare and about fiscal stimulus, which progressives wanted more of and libertarians wanted a whole lot less of. So things got pretty testy between those two camps when we got married in 2010. And I think you were at my wedding.
I was there.
It was a blur. Well, I think our wedding had the first Twitter hashtag, actually, of a wedding. It was invented by our guests. I did not, by the way, publish the Twitter hashtag. But we were working on the seating, and we just ended up sticking the liberals and the social conservatives and the libertarians in three different corners because there were some people we just want to keep as far as possible. But now, 15 years later, I think you and I are a lot closer than we were in 2008. God, that's almost 20 years. Or at least we have a lot more common enemies, right? So I want to talk about that journey and whether it says more about us or about what's happened to American politics in the meantime. So I want to start with some history. In 2007, Ross Douthat and Reihan Salam organized a dinner party with a bunch of bloggers at the house of David Bradley, who then owned The Atlantic. And we were there. I was told to explain blogs to David and The Atlantic's editor-in-chief, James Bennett. I should add that I got there late and I mistook James Bennett for the IT guy. And I did not figure that out until after the meeting. But everyone at that dinner got a job offer from The Atlantic except for one person, if you remember. And that person was Ezra Klein. It's possibly the biggest hiring mistake that either James Bennett or David Bradley has ever made. But benefit of the Washington Post, he went on to found a very influential policy blog here at the Washington Post. And it was an era when the internet really started to change politics and mainstream media. Or did it? Do you think blogging changed what media was doing?
Sort of. I mean, I don't know, right? I mean, there's like a million like micro rise and falls of different kinds of things like this. But like one thing that I do think like bloggers were responsible for was the infusion of much more academic social science
and data
into the coverage of politics and public policy, which is something that in retrospect I have very mixed feelings about. But at the time was very
spicy take, Matt. Can you explain that a little bit?
I mean, I think that I was, how do I put it? I've come to appreciate more, I think, the wisdom of the old farts. about certain kinds of things in the political domain in particular. And, I also was, I think, a little naive when 15 years ago about the reliability and extent of ideological bias in academic social science.
This used to make me bonkers because we would, I had a fight, actually, I think I had a fight with Ezra where the day after Obamacare passed, I was like, okay, well, here's all these predictions that you should take from the rhetoric surrounding this, right? For example, that 100,000 people are dying every year for lack of health insurance. So our mortality curve should shift. And infant mortality should drop by this much. Like, is anyone willing to stand by those predictions? And someone came back to me and said, I'm willing to say that a peer-reviewed study by 2014 will show that this happened. And I was like, peer-reviewed is not a synonym for true.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there in the wake of Obamacare, there were a lot of like synthetic studies, synthetic in the sense that we didn't have a control group. And so you would take counties and look at where something had happened and you would compare them to other counties and you would try to make an imaginary city that looks like Seattle by stitching together a bunch of neighborhoods. I know you know this, but not all of our listeners do. There's an industry of people who are going to BS you about what reality looks like, about how strong the evidence is. And I know you like them. I know it makes you happy to hear these things, but you need to have a sense of where the BS lies and who is more likely to be playing it straight.
Yeah, and it's very challenging. I mean, I remember one time, this was probably 10 years ago now, but I was like trying to explain to a very junior person at Vox. I was like, you can't look up research coming out of education schools if you want to understand slingshot education. And she was like, huh? And I was like, those guys, like, they don't know what they're talking about. Like this super duper duper left wing, like talk to this guy. And I was like, I was giving good advice, but I sounded like a crazy person.
But this brings up actually in 2014, you and Ezra co-founded Vox alongside Melissa Bell. And why did you do that? Why did you leave? You had a job at Slate. Ezra was here at the Washington Post. I can't imagine why anyone would ever leave. So what was the idea there?
Well, I mean, this is a lot in the mix, but I mean, I think the biggest thing is that by 2014, people like Ezra and I and you and other sort of early bloggers had been doing this for a long time. We had like meaningful experience about digital journalism. And also by that time, nobody was saying anymore to me, like, you need to learn how to write print magazine features. Like everybody understood that digital was the future, but the leaders of every institution, right, that was now a print digital hybrid, it was still old print guys were in charge of everything because they just were the right age. But it was a time when I actually had more experience than people who were older than me, but who had only switched to focusing on digital in 2008, 2010, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I mean, in sort of a meta sense, like that's what it was. There was also an investment boom in digital media at that time, driven by Facebook and some other things that were going on. So it was an opportunity to get money for digital products. And I think there was a generation of digital media professionals who actually had the experience to say, we understand this industry like better than the people who you currently have in charge. And you should,
Although, as it turned out, you didn't understand it as well as you thought. One of the things that fascinates me about your talking about the time at Vox is that it went out, Ezra had founded this blog here called Wonk Blog, and it was all about policy and white papers and so forth. And that was the original theory behind Vox, right? Was that the world wanted more explainers. It wanted more data. It wanted more. Am I wrong about this?
No. I mean, it is. But I mean, I do think like the theory really was, I mean, this is like VC wisdom, but it's just like if you back like smart people who know what they're talking about, like they will figure it out. And on that level, like I think we did. What I actually got like really wrong about this, though, is that, I really thought at least, that the old dinosaurs were going to be disrupted, that there just was no way that the New York Times and the Washington Post would like continue to change and adapt. And like we'd be sitting here in a video podcast studio, and just like that was wrong. It's actually like, obviously the whole newspaper industry was sort of plowed under by the existence of the competition. But like the best people in traditional journalism actually managed the transition of their institutions reasonably well in a like objectively difficult situation. But the New York Times was like the most important newspaper in 1995, and it's the most important newspaper.
Fact check false, Matt.
Yeah, there's just been like less disruption than I thought there would be. And so all these digital entrants, I mean, Vox still exists, which puts it head and shoulders above Policy Mike or Upworthy or these other things. But it was like, people, you, me, Ezra from earlier are still around. But that whole startup wave just didn't amount to much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it changed a lot of things. And one thing that it changed was it was the thing that you ultimately dubbed the Great Awokening. And one of the great coinages, I seethe with jealousy every time I think about it. And that was one of the things you said was that at Vox, you went in and you had an idea. You were going to do these note cards explaining things. And then it turned out that what social media really rewarded was identity politics. Yep. And that change didn't just change Vox, right? This then boomerangs back into the mainstream media. And that, BuzzFeed, all of these places, everyone is leaning into these algorithms. Can you talk about this? Like, what happened in the Great Awakening? How much of it was that social media algorithms were rewarding that kind of content, and how much of it was that the culture was changing?
I mean, there's surely some of both, and I wish we could put like Mark Zuckerberg under the microscope. But I mean, if only we'd done an RCT. Something changed, right? Like there was a time, I mean, just the fact that you could get an incredible amount of internet traffic off of Facebook was not true like before 2013. And it is not true. It's also not true today, right? So there was like a window of opportunity where an article on the internet might go viral on Facebook. And that opportunity was so large that trying to go viral on Facebook became a very dominant business strategy. Lots of different kinds of things could go viral on Facebook. And so in that era, I mean, a pretty reliable source of like good traffic was like the BuzzFeed version of this was like 27 ways like this old TV show was like racist and problematic. Vox had like a kind of more highbrow version of that. But like it was the same.
The 13 best ways.
Yeah, but it was like the same thing. Like new ways to show that other people were being racist or sexist or otherwise problematic, and like you were more evolved. And I think it is one of our social media people at that time sort of explained how it worked. That it was like what drives sharing isn't what the article says. It's what the fact that you are sharing it says about you. Right. And so it was a way to distinguish yourself as, more elevated, to be sharing this kind of content. And then if you came across it, like to not share it would suggest that you were part of like the racist cabal behind Seinfeld reruns or whatever else. And so you would need to go do it. And this was a really, this came from the culture, right? I mean, it became that like the worst thing that you could do is like be problematic on these domains, but it also changed culture, right? I mean, it led to different people being hired, led to different people being promoted. Early stage journalism is really kind of a tough career, like,
oh yeah,
there's, you get entry-level jobs that don't pay that well, but you get your foot in the door, you get a chance, but then you either need to like move up or come up with something else to do in your life. And so the people who were good at writing these pieces are the ones who are moving up. And they continue to be in the field, right? As the algorithms have changed and so on and so forth, this kind of, there's this, archaeological layer cake of journalism. And these like late Obama, like super woke hires are, very much with us.
Now, sadly, almost the bottom level of sediment is crusty old bloggers who are...
No, absolutely. And the other thing is that like, there's a little bit of cynicism in media, but it's hard to do things if you're not sincere about it, right? So it's just the thing that was performing best was a certain kind of content. So the people who were really into that were doing well. And they themselves weren't just like BSing about it. But maybe, I remember myself, my colleagues, older editors who I know were all kind of looking around at the time being like, this is what people want to read. But it was like, again, all of us a little naive about social media at that time.
Yeah.
And it just seemed like, well, Facebook had discovered like a truth about the audience that was like profound and real and we had to adapt to. And now I think we understand that, I mean, of course, like social media does hold a mirror up to society, but they also...
The algorithms were choosing what to show people, right? It was not just simply the invisible hand of the market operating in its mysterious and dynamic way.
And then when they decided to make the content less political, like that...
Ironically, I mean, the ironic thing about that, right, is the reason they did that was that after Trump was elected, who had surfed his own kind of social media fame, right? He was harvesting the fact that people like to get angry about stuff. And ironically, all the people retweeting him were amplifying him and making him seem more important, more... But after he got elected, a bunch of progressives who were really upset about this decided that the problem was that Facebook had allowed like the Russians to buy ads. They had allowed their data to be scrubbed by the Trump campaign, and Facebook's response to that was, well, you guys are all mad at me and this is making me really upset and I don't want Washington interference, so like I'm just going to de-emphasize politics, problem solved. But of course, the thing that had been feeding the very people who were screaming at Facebook was the Facebook algorithms. So how did the Great Awakening affect your politics?
I mean, I guess, I mean, it was, I mean, a funny thing is that I used to be, I would say, if you look at like the discourse of 2013, I was like a pretty woke person.
Yeah, I remember.
Relative to how it was. And like, I was really big on like, like racial resentment literature and like correlations and all this stuff. And some like older, like Alberto Alesina papers about like America has no welfare state because a smaller welfare state because of racial animosity. Ta-Nehisi Coates was a guest blogger for me at The Atlantic at one point, et cetera.
And then at one point, the most famous blogger at The Atlantic.
Yes. Things escalated. And I mean, there are times when like you change and there's times when the world changes. And this is like a little of both. But, I mean, there was I guess I would say that I always took these questions of like race and gender identity issues quite seriously, like at a time when nobody thought it was like good to be writing about these things. I did and was like definitely on the more like woke side of things. But by the same token, when the fashion changed, I didn't want to like change all of my opinions, right? So I was very influenced, going back to when I was an undergraduate, by William Julius Wilson's writing and thinking on this. And, he said a lot of things, but like one of his big points was that if you take seriously the idea that racial conflict is a big force in American politics and you want to help the especially disadvantaged, that means you want to be constantly downplaying race, right? Like that was his take. And so I always agreed with that, right? And I thought that there was something really perverse about this idea of like American society is deeply shaped by racism. And therefore, what we on the progressive side need to do is talk about that constantly so that we always lose.
Why? Yeah, that has always seemed mysterious to me. Because I mean, I watched people who were fighting over whether all the Trump voters were racist. I don't think that's a very good account of what happened, without denying that there are some Trump voters who are racist and even some Trump voters who are racist and voted for Trump because they are racist, right? But even leaving that aside, I would get into debates with people. I won't name names, but we would go back and forth a few rounds and they would get angrier and angrier. And I would be like, I don't think this is right. And they would be like, so you love racism, basically. And and I would watch the same people every time they would come across some little bit of data that might suggest that Trump voters, it's all about race. They would be thrilled. They would rush to social media and trumpet it like, see, I was right. And I was like, what do you think you win if they're all racist, right? That tells you half the country are irredeemable racists. And doesn't that mean that your whole political project is pretty much doomed? And it was really that they were fighting an internal kind of elite battle, right, over who the good people were. And they felt like if they won and they could prove the Republicans were bad people, that would give them a victory within the spaces they worked in. But it would also, it's not going to it doesn't do anything. You can't disenfranchise voters because they're racists, right? That's not how
Right.
democracy works.
I mean, one way I think about this is that, if you're on a college campus, right, and you're in some kind of disagreement with somebody, if you go say, I think that your idea would just be objectively bad for people who are poor, it's like nothing's going to happen. Right? You can have that opinion, you could be correct, but just you're allowed to do that. But if I say, I think the opinion you just expressed is racist, if I can convince the RA, you may be made to shut up, right? And so people are habituated in this idea that proving, if you could demonstrate that anti-immigrant politics is really driven by racism, then it's you win the argument, right? On campus.
Yes, exactly. But this is where everyone's trying to win arguments on campus or in the newsroom. And the voters don't care. Even if they are racist, you can tell them they're racist and they're going to be like, okay, I'm a racist.
Exactly, right. So it's in the real world, it may or may not be true. It's interesting to try to understand exactly what drives people's opinions about immigration. But their opinions are their opinions. You can talk them out of it or you can pander to it. But you can't just be well, you're not allowed to have that opinion.
I think I once said, look, someone's going to pick these voters up. If you were right that they're all racist, someone is going to pick the voters up. And I can't remember who it was, but someone immediately came back and said, so it's okay to pander to racists. And I was like, what? How do you think democracy works?
This was a huge thing. I mean, 2017, 2018, 2019 in progressive politics. I mean, this is, I think it's been reported publicly in The Intercept, old war stories from NARAL. But, after the election, they wanted to say, we know that a large number of pro-choice women in the Midwest flipped from Obama to Trump. And we want to understand what those women think so that we can get them to vote for pro-choice candidates in the future. And it was incredibly contentious on the staff. It was well, we can't be obviously they flipped to Trump because they're racist. And so we can't be pandering to racism. We need to develop new ways to mobilize women of color to vote for us. And that's just not what politics is, right?
This was also animated by an incorrect theory of the electorate that as immigration made it browner, it would inevitably just give Democrats majorities and they wouldn't have to pander to the races.
But similar to what we were saying about the fundraising too, it's a transition of politics from being a slightly grubby transactional space for professionals to being this very expressive
performative space.
Yeah, where people want to share their feelings about the world, right? Which are that these people are very bad, which is, it's one of the paradoxes of democratic politics, right? Because the stakes in a presidential election are very high. It's quite bad to elect the wrong person. So there is actually something but I
mean, yes and no. I actually miss the days when the stakes weren't that high. You and I have been hearing now for our entire life that this is the most important election of our lifetime. But honestly, if John McCain had been elected, we wouldn't have Obamacare, right? That is, we would have gotten some sort of healthcare plan because he felt like he had to do something to assuage voters. We would probably gotten somewhere in the neighborhood of roughly the same financial regulation, maybe probably less stimulus. But you and I have disagreed on how much stimulus we needed. But the difference is it's not that it wouldn't have affected anyone's life or it wouldn't have mattered, but it wouldn't have mattered in the way that the difference between electing Donald Trump and electing Kamala Harris matters, right? Those were really Clinton versus Dole. It all seemed very dramatic and important at the time. Very low stakes compared to now.
But I mean, I just mean that however high the stakes get, you just do have to keep going along. I mean, where it gets really scary is where you get into people saying, that's not the case, right?
I think this is perhaps one of the reasons that you and I have grown together is that everyone else went insane. Well, not everyone. Many, many other people went insane.
I guess maybe the more formalistic way I would put it, right, is liberalism, right, in a philosophical sense, is very deeply ingrained in American political culture and American political history. the values in the Declaration of Independence and Locke and Jefferson and all this kind of stuff. And, you had a kind of a liberal center to American politics that was present in both political coalitions, that also both partisan coalitions
Right.
that also had like illiberal elements, but the liberal elements were predominant in both parties. And people like you and I, in a sense, were mostly arguing about like whose coalition mates were like more unsavory in some respects, right? And then what happened is that you had a subsuming, right? So you still have a liberal center in American politics that is still divided across two partisan coalitions, but has now become the secondary partner in both of them. Right. So it seems like it's probably actually like a pretty numerically small amount of people who've like gone crazy, but it's led to a great increase in the like empowerment of the craziness.
The tipping point, the preference cascade, where it turns out. I think it's also, though, that you and I, correct me if I'm wrong, we have changed our politics to make them more palatable. But I think you and I at some point just decided we were going to work in the available policy space. Right? I can still describe all the great ways we could privatize Medicare and Social Security, but I have recognized that the American public is never going to privatize Medicare and Social Security. I'm sure you could name issues where you could imagine like a great scheme if history had been different, but it's just not going to happen. And so you've decided to work within the parameters of what actually might conceivably be done.
Yes, I mean, there's that. But I also think that the window of possibilities has shifted a lot.
Not the Overton window.
I won't put it that way. The policy status quo moved substantially to the left during Barack Obama's presidency in a way that was not meaningfully reversed during Donald Trump's first presidency. And that a way that I think has caused you to become accepting of certain aspects of
accepting might be a strong word. I have bowed to reality.
Sure.
I say my heart still beats in, with the fire of free markets.
And I am less fired up about it because a lot of things that I believed in were achieved. And you now I never used to think that hard about like, what did I like really think about the prospect of a left-wing political coalition wielding governing power in a substantial part of the United States of America? Because it was very sort of non-planetary, you know what I mean? And if I wanted a progressive political power, like in some kind of sense, and then I thought we could get like some policies that I thought were good. We're now like in a very different world, like I have some real concern that like there's going to be statewide rent control initiatives. I think there is one in Washington now, and there clearly could be one in other jurisdictions.
And in New York, they're going to try to freeze the rents even as inflation is rising pretty fast.
But yes, I mean, I would not have said that rent control is a good idea in 2007. But if somebody wanted to like this, my politics is like really about explaining to you that these leftists and the rent control I'd be like, come on, like who cares, right?
Why are you subtweeting me, Matt?
But now like this is a quite real thing. And it's like a very serious, issue that's really worth talking about because there are people with influence who have, I think, very unsound left-wing economic ideas who were not empowered in a meaningful way 10 to 15 years ago. They were around, but like I was not like, oh no, what's going to happen?
So let me ask you, I mean, in some ways, you said that policy shifted left during the Obama administration. I think that's right. There's lots of things that like I don't think we're going to undo Obamacare. And in fact, despite the fact that I spent a lot of time opposing Obamacare, when Republicans came in with having promised to repeal Obamacare and yet having never in the 97 million votes they took to repeal Obamacare developed an alternative to Obamacare, I told Republicans not to do it because they didn't have a plan and the thing that they did have was not going to work. Path dependence is a real thing. For listeners who don't know, that just means like, look, quitting smoking is not the same thing as never having smoked. Some decisions you cannot go back from, you just have to go forward from. And But now the Trump administration has made some moves that I think are likely to, on very different issues, shift policy permanently to the right. Right? I think what has happened at universities, for example, the funding can be restored. Maybe it will or maybe it won't. I support restoring it. I love, academic research. I maybe support reforming how you hand the money out. Probably could be done better. But the stuff on admissions, the stuff on civil rights, for a long time, universities were like breaking the law. It was never legal to say, we're not going to hire a white man for this job. We're reserving this for a woman of color. And yet people would say things like that to me at conferences. But the Trump administration has changed that calculation fundamentally, because even if Democrats get back in, what you understand is if I do this stuff when Democrats are in, I will face like really bad civil rights investigations when they are out. So first of all, do you think there are other areas where that's happened? And second of all, how does that change? Right? Just as the fact that policy moved left and we reacted to that, how is that going to change like the next generation of Megan McArdle and Matt Yglesias political thought?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not 100% sure those changes in universities are going to be as sticky as you're saying, versus people just being more careful about what it is they say and do.
I think it's really hard. I mean, you see this in insider trading. It's really hard to do a conspiracy with a lot of people without someone like writing an email and being like, "Hey guys, I did the crime."
I mean, well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I was surprised by how little change there was after the Students for Fair Admissions case came down. That like basically every major university was like, we're just like not going to follow this ruling.
Were you surprised? I thought that my assumption was that they were going to try to skirt the law.
I was surprised. I was surprised by the reaction to it. And then I was, because, well, whatever. It's hard to predict what's going to happen in the future. But I mean, I do think that this will change things in ways that themselves are unpredictable. I mean, on the one hand, the level of sort of soft quotas and like racial balancing that elite universities were doing, it's very unpopular. It doesn't withstand public scrutiny. On the other hand, I think the calculus that the universities were making was that people will find an institution that doesn't manifest diversity to lack a certain kind of social and political legitimacy.
I think that's right. Like I've argued, I have complex feelings about affirmative action. I'm not against it as a matter of principle, but I think it's sort of become unwieldy in a society that isn't just black and white.
So you've gone so left. It's just like
I was always though like I was writing articles at The Atlantic trying to convince conservatives that systemic racism was real.
No, so I'm just saying like it'll be there's going to be like multiple moves in this dynamic, right? Where like at a certain point, people are going to look around and they're going to be like, how come like there's no black students in your new class at Harvard?
I think that that's right, but I also think that this isn't that people's expression on this issue is more complicated than it looks on a poll. When you ask someone, do you think that you should take underrepresented minority students and boost their applications over white students or Asian students who do better on all of the that have better SATs, GPAs, et cetera, people will say, no, obviously that's terrible. But they also really want their institutions to represent America. They want them to look like, they do not want an elite that is all white and Asian. They do not want an elite that, doesn't know anyone from, actually, they have an elite that doesn't know anyone from the working class, but they want things that are incompatible with that principle. And as long as affirmative action was allowed, it was cheap to hold the idea that it shouldn't be allowed. All right. So I want to go back to social media for a bit in our closing segment here. You've recently been arguing in your newsletter that social media is a problem, that it is, that we should treat it like a vice. Right. So can you talk about this a bit?
Yeah, one thing is, I use the term social media, as does everybody. We're all sort of stuck with it. But I think one thing important to understand is that it's become like not very social at all. The idea of following, seeing posts from your friends and stuff is very obsolete. We're getting a lot of, algorithmically distributed short form video, which is fine. People like to watch video.
I love the rug pressure washing videos. Oh, so good. So satisfying.
I keep watching videos of people building campfires. I'm like, I don't know why. I enjoy them. Derek Thompson had a great headline for saying, was like, everything is television now.
Yeah.
And I think that's basically correct. And just to understand that all the many things that have happened in internet and media and content and so on and so forth, what it's amounted to across the past 40 years is that we all have a TV in our pocket all the time, and there's always something on that you want to watch. But, and like, there's a lot of upside to this. I mean, capitalism like works more or less. Like, this is a product that people enjoy. Life is much less boring than it used to be. You can, commute on a bus or be stuck in a plane delay and not run out of like ways to amuse and entertain yourself. But, it does mean that, like, if you had just asked in 1995, like, what if everybody like watched just like way more TV in the future? You'll be like, And I was like, but what if they really enjoy the TV? You'd be like, well, that's good. But like, still, like, we have people are sleeping less. They're reading less. They're spending less time with friends. They're spending less time with family. They're having fewer children. They're going to church less. They're working less. This is not, I think, like, anybody. I mean, now neither of us are real social conservatives, but like, this is just not anybody's vision of the good life.
Yeah, I will say that while I'm not that addicted to TikTok, what I substitute is iPad games, which I love.
Well, there you go.
And there again, like, it's just not that important to my life.
I think, as with a lot of vice type things, people who are in the top whatever percent of conscientiousness and whatever else can dabble in these vices, can get drunk sometimes, especially when they're young, or do cocaine. What did President Obama say? Do a little blow, and move on, and you're fine. But that, how society is set up in terms of its like guardrails matters a lot for younger people, and especially for people who are in the bottom half of the distribution on these self-discipline kind of things. And we've created just a big class of sort of, time-wasty temptations that are preventing people from getting on the track to. There's just a difference, I think, between zoning out with some iPad games, at night after you've worked a full day and done something with friends or family or spouse, and waking up in the morning and that's what you're doing, because you haven't built any of those other cornerstones of life.
So, but how do you fix this, right? I mean, this is the really hard question: is how do you? I think about this. I mean, I will admit this is an outrageously unlibertarian position, but I think there are a lot of things in life that are better with friction, right? It is better if you're going to do sports gambling if you have to actually go to a casino and lay a bet, because then you don't like sit in the middle of the game and get high on the dopamine and start gambling on stupid stuff. I mean, what do you do to increase those frictions? Sports gambling, I can name how you would increase the friction.
I think for one thing, you start with things that it seems like have a good solution. I mean, I don't want to be such a like, something must be done. This is something.
Therefore, this must be done. The famous,
right.
Yes.
But I think that if you, there was a lot of utopianism about the internet in its early days.
Because it was utopian. Come on, wouldn't you like to go back there?
Absolutely. No, but a kind of like Trump card argument about anything was like, well, this will make it like harder for people to have internet companies, or this will make it harder for people to get on the internet. And when we flip that, and you're not like at all costs, we have to get people to stop scrolling TikTok, but just that if the downside of this policy is that it's going to reduce consumption of streaming video, like that's fine, right? I think like the backyard poker game is a good one, because a big problem with the old drug regime was that like the war on drugs, quote unquote, was like a very costly undertaking. We didn't have a war on gambling. It was illegal, but like if you wanted to gamble, like with your friend, like you could. Nobody was stopping you. Nobody would ever kick down your door of a backyard poker game. It was just, you couldn't open a casino outside of Las Vegas because then the police would come after you, right? So, you can do things to push stuff down without going wildly overboard. I think taxes are important here, no matter how libertarian a person may be.
So tax video games and
There,
TikTok?
there is a lot of taxation
Right.
in the United States, and thinking about what that tax base is and how it's structured. I think maybe we should be trying to come up with some kind of progressive tax on broadband consumption, and lower retail sales taxes or income taxes or other kinds of things like that. I mean, I don't know, exactly how you want to work it out, but I would challenge policymakers to, orient themselves toward the thought that I think most people in their reflective moments think we are all spending a little bit too much time scrolling relative to what we should be.
Do you think there is any way to, we've talked about how to repair the personal downsides of this stuff, maybe. Is there any way to repair the institutional damage that was done by the earlier social media problems with the Great Awokening because one thing that I have observed is that there seem to be a hell of a lot of walking wounded at America's elites at this point. People who have been canceled, watched their friends canceled, and they're all, and this is, by the way, now bipartisan, right? It's not on one side. And they're really hurt and angry, and it is coming out in a preference for policies that are actually worse, objectively in terms of achieving the goal you want, but allow you to express your anger and make the other side hurt.
I mean, look, there's a universe, a better mirror universe in which, in 2021, Trump is officially impeached after January 6th. And then instead of this surge of progressive policy activism, we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on COVID and woke cancellations. And
I think a lot of the damage had already been done by then, right? In 2020,
no, it had been done. But I'm saying that was I think there was a lost opportunity for a self-conscious repair moment.
Yeah.
Right. And Biden did not take it in that direction, right? And so now we're really deep in the and, weird stuff happens. I don't think, Trump's whole rise to power was highly foreseeable or widely foreseen by people. There's a lot of weird events and agency occurs in the universe. I think it's clear that if we just keep there's a destabilizing ratchet dynamic that we're in now in our political moments, but we will have yet another set of primary campaigns, yet another opportunity to pick good rather than bad candidates. And, you can only hope that the good prevails.
I like to remember that the last thing to come out of Pandora's box was hope. So final question. Remember, this one's for the whole game, Matt. So what makes you optimistic about America right now?
America is objectively doing better than any other country that I can think of, right?
Okay, but no, let's go beyond the prettiest ugly house on the block.
No, but I think that matters because I think that all of our societies are being buffeted by some of these same destabilizing currents that are coming from technological change, and I think that it should give us some real sense of value in the kind of American mission statement and American culture and American political tradition that as much as things have not gone exactly as I would like them to here.
Certainly not like I thought they were going to go.
Right. But I do think that we are holding up better than the vast majority of comparable societies around the world to these kinds of things, and that there are important, real resources in the American tradition, which has always been self-consciously diverse, self-consciously liberal, self-consciously sort of a community of communities, right? And those are the kinds of ideas that everybody needs to get through this, but that I'm not sure whether it's France or China, that they can get there. That involves a bigger change in the self-conception of what's going on here. Whereas to me, good old-fashioned American wisdom has a lot of applicability accessibility to today's problems. And that's a resource that people can always have at hand and can draw on.
One might even say our libertarian spirit.
Something like that.
Matt, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.